Whenever I find myself thinking about what my favorite Sonic game is, or really any game for that matter, the choices I come to tend to fall into three different camps. The first would be games I consider to be more narratively driven, entries I don't necessarily feel the most fond of in the gameplay department, but the experience of the story itself, whether it's watching it unfold or participating in it on a deeper level, is really what grips me. Then of course, in contrast, there's the games I simply come back to all the time because they're just fun to play. If they have a story attached, it might even be such a non-entity to my enjoyment that I skip over it beyond my first playthrough. Lastly would be the games that encompass each side. Some of these have both the story and gameplay that rival the enjoyment of my favorites in the other categories, while others I don't find either aspects quite reach the heights of games I solely like for just one. But I still keep coming back to these because both halves of the equation, being a solid combination, can equal an experience greater than the sum of its parts. And that's where Sonic Unleashed fits in for me. It's a game with an interesting reputation to say the least. For the longest time, it felt like everyone hated the entry, from your reviewers to your average consumer.
It's a big piece of garbage. Big piece of garbage.
But in recent times, it almost feels like a shift has occurred in the complete opposite direction, to the point of it becoming a meme in the community, with countless posts proclaiming,
"Am I the only one who likes Sonic Unleashed?"
I mean, you even have such absurdities as defending the battle music being a 30-second loop that plays ad nauseum, drowning out the genuinely beautiful music many levels have. But that's sort of the funny thing. The praise of Unleashed as a result seems completely vapid and worthless, put forward by a strict nostalgia of one's past. Very rarely do people go into the genuine positives I find in the game, and it mostly boils down to, as said, oh, I had fond memories of that game as a child, which there's certainly nothing wrong with having that reasoning. However, it is a statement that can be put toward anything and everything, regardless of quality. I mean, we see it coming up now with games I believe to be genuinely bad in the series. So just as well, when Unleashed's praises seem this hollow, and covered by pure fanboyism, I feel the conversation buries the game's merits just as much as it did back in 2008. Unleashed does deserve more praise than it ever got, and perhaps that's more true, now in a time when even many of those that speak positively end up burying what makes it stand out. But to get there, I'd like to take a step back and look briefly at another set of games that have also shifted in the public consciousness back and forth over the years. That would be Sonic Adventure 1 and 2.
File select.
There's a lot of reasons I think these games stand out in Sonic's catalog, but in terms of how they relate to Unleashed, the aspect I want to focus on is simple. It's their name. Both Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 earned that adventure title. Sonic games before them had very minimal story and scope, while Sonic 3 and Knuckles definitely dipped its toes into those elements. The jump to Sonic Adventure 1 was huge. You were given a hub world connecting each stage you went to, and the world in general just felt more lived in. The various NPCs scattered around the hub would often comment on the current point in the story, furthering how this place is affected by your actions. And perhaps even more meaningful to the state of a lived-in world is they would have their own personal stories in life going on if you chose to talk to them, some with very relatable narratives, such as wanting to date Amy Rose. Then there were 6 playable characters, with various intersections in their own stories that led to one grander. The sequel of course streamlined various aspects, taking away things like the hub, but in its place it held that grandiose illusion in other ways, such as looking at the map and seeing where these locations are in the world. The way various title cards would give context for scenes in relation to other events, as well as better production value across the board. As such, I can see preferences for these two games going either way. However, all of this is to say, yes, these games feel like an adventure. A Sonic adventure, if you will. Which brings us back to today's topic, as despite the heights of those games, I'm of the opinion that nothing captures that feeling better than Sonic Unleashed, or to call it by its Japanese name, Sonic World Adventure. The scope on display for this entry was not something we've ever seen before, and as time marches forward, I don't think we ever will again, honestly. It was evident the moment the player presses start and they're immediately thrust into an action-packed cinematic. We see Sonic landing on one of Eggman's fleet, high above the planet, quickly dispatching all of Eggman's new robots, with fancy tricks and even having the Chaos Emeralds at his disposal. At this point, these CGI openings were no stranger to the series, but the thing that stuck out particularly with this one is how it felt like the climax to a game we never got. That previous description very much feels like the ending of so many adventures in this series, doesn't it? That being the case, I always wanted to know the story of how we got here, and I would often theorize getting a game as a prequel, maybe visiting different areas than that of Unleashed, seeing the story unfold that got Sonic the Emeralds the first time. There was a point where I thought Chronicles, of all things, was leading into this game canonically, but none of those wishes came to pass, for better or worse. Point being, it really was from the very first moment that my mind started racing, that this game felt so expansive, and I feel this opening cinematic perfectly encapsulates that scope this game was aiming for. I mean, so far we're just talking about the setting here. None of that is to mention the quality of this animation, the fluidity of each action, the cinematography, how the camera movements slow down to hang on action shots, displaying both Sonic's speed and personality. This carrying over to the slower bits later where we actually see Sonic and Eggman interact. Suffice to say, it's all top notch. Simultaneously though, with all the positives this cinematic brought, it did come with glimpses of negativity. Firstly, that of one singular frame that was absolutely inescapable in any Sonic discussions on the internet for the next decade. Then the second and most obvious being the Werehog. From the instant it was revealed, it was steeped in mixed opinions. I don't think that fact has ever changed, and I can't say my own thoughts are that far off. In fact, perhaps thematically appropriately so, this is how I would describe the Werehog. While I see Sonic himself as the symbol for all the positives that came with the ambition this game brought to the table, the Werehog stands for the dark side of what ambition can bring. And that will be our keyword for the day, as well as where this story truly starts: ambition. While that opening cinematic for many fans and average players had been the first clear sign of the heights this game was shooting for, behind the scenes, this path was set from the moment Yoshihisa Hashimoto took the helm. Hashimoto was no stranger to Sonic. He had been with the series since Sonic Adventure, but not in the director's chair. He's a designer by trade, and was in part responsible for handling one of the fan-favorite features of those adventure titles, the A-Life system, more commonly known as the Chow. He would later go on the program in various other Sonic games, such as Advance, before that eventual spot in the director's chair with Unleashed, which I'm not bringing up these tidbits just to give a rundown of the director's past. I think Hashimoto being a designer first and foremost is part of the reason Unleashed ended up the way it did, as it's not as if he stopped designing on this go-around. That's still his passion, his craft, and it steered much of this project's goals. In fact, just as important as that directing position, Hashimoto was also the chief technology officer of the Hedgehog engine, Unleashed being the first game to use said engine. And upon looking up interviews both pre and post-release, it was very clear how proud he was of his and his team's accomplishments, frequently referencing its lighting and shadow capabilities, how the technology would read and calculate data just to catch up to Sonic's speed. I'm not a programmer. I don't own a single pair of thigh-high socks, so I can't truly comprehend what goes into these systems. But what I can see is the results. And this game is beautiful. All these years later, and it's still one of the most impressive looking Sonic games. I'm not really a graphics person, to be honest. It's low on my priority list. So don't take this as me saying, whoa, the graphics number is big, but presentation is something that can certainly elevate an experience. For me, the beauty of Unleashed is specifically because it's not fully realistic. It's still stylized, but in a way that abstracts the real world. It takes what seems so beautiful about looking at some Italian architecture or a grassy field and translates it into this world. That beauty comes at a price though. While certainly one of the best looking Sonic games, it's definitely not the most stable. Playing on the original 360 release would leave you mostly at 30 FPS, but there are points in the game that will dip as low as 15. While playing on the PS3, you could have gotten frame rates as high as 60. but those times were few and far between. Again, this version once more dipping to 15 at times. As powerful as these systems seemed, they just didn't have enough blast processing to handle Sonic the Hedgehog. For the longest time, the only way you'd be getting Unleashed at a consistent frame rate was through emulation, and that was only a lucky few that I can thankfully count myself among. But even then, to do so I had to remove some minor effects, such as real-time reflections from problematic levels, and various other things, just so I could play it at that solid 60 FPS. I, in my lack of knowledge, was able to do this because of those Sonic fans and the tools they've created. These days, you can thankfully play the game on an Xbox Series S or X, where the game mostly runs at a solid 60 FPS natively, meaning it took literally over a decade for technology to catch up. I'm sure more optimizations could have been done at the time, but that's just the ambitions of Sonic Unleashed. Both the positives and negatives are on display here. It created this beautiful world, but in that stride, to create something so stunning, the engine falls to its knees under those same ambitions, making it that much harder to appreciate at the time, and I think that's understandable for those who didn't. However, those goals set forth by Hashimoto led to far more than just a pretty world.
Here we go!
Something else you'll find that rings true of most interviews from Hashimoto, to the point where it's trivia on his Sonic wiki page, is that he believed Sonic Unleashed was what Sonic should be.
There it is! There it is!
That might sound like sacrilege to those fans of the adventure game style, but let me explain what I think he meant with this statement, with one of my own beliefs about the gameplay. Take for example the opening of Sonic CD, how fast Sonic is moving across the terrain, the tricks and other actions he does in that time, or even go back to that opening movie from Unleashed itself, how it has all of those aspects as well. Really, anytime Sonic's abilities are visually displayed without you taking control as a player. Sonic Unleashed is about that speed, that style. Its level design was very much made in a similar manner to an obstacle course. It feels exhilarating. Much like the classics, there's a lot of alternate routes and paths scattered throughout each course. Reacting fast, memorizing the best routes, will lead you to getting through with better and better times, while failing those obstacles won't usually leave you for dead, instead just putting you on a lower path that might be slower, as a punishment. Sure, at first a situation or two might crop up in those moments that feels frustrating, because you couldn't react fast enough to the split-second decisions. But I honestly felt like that at times in the speedier levels of the classics as well. And just like there, when you have that down, when you run through these levels, it can almost feel like a rhythm game. The way you get into the flow when you nail that execution, getting that perfect run, not only feels good, but it visually looks so damn impressive to boot. Saying the game makes you feel like Sonic the Hedgehog is perhaps cliche, but I believe in some respect that was the goal here, to make Unleashed the first game that truly captured that version of Sonic that we see in cutscenes. And again, I think they hit the mark with that. It's exciting coming back to this game with every run-through of these 5 to 8 minute levels, which might not sound like a lot of time, but think about how much ground Sonic the Hedgehog would cover in that time frame. Fittingly, the game creates massive levels that you just blast through. You hardly get to appreciate the gorgeous scenery constructed. Like, think about that. How much work went into parts of this game that are just a blue blur? But that might also be what leads to the only aspect of this gameplay style I believe is a negative. When starting a new playthrough, Sonic can feel pretty gimped. These games always lack a few abilities such as the lightspeed dash to later points in the game, but not having the stomp here, the air boost, wall jumping, your full speed even, on top of those typical abilities, always makes the early sections feel off, while clearly being designed around your later skills. You can't quite get into the rhythmic flow I mentioned, but this is perhaps to slow you down. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't have it the other way around. I'm glad these levels have sections that open up when coming back to them, and just as well, maybe someone wouldn't feel as bothered by this when it's their first time. They might just think, wow, this game keeps getting better, as they unlock new abilities. However, later games like Colors and Generations, as well as some earlier titles, fare better in this department, not feeling quite as limiting when starting a new file, so I think it's worth mentioning. That said, this might sound pretty good, if it's my only negative. And as far as Sonic's concerned, yeah, it is. When the worst thing you can really say about a game is damn, I wish I got all of my abilities faster because it's just so fun to play. That's awesome. However, like most Sonic games in the mid to late 2000s, Sonic's gameplay is only about 1/3 of the game. So while this is where the negatives with him end, it's certainly not where the game's problems do. Just kidding. Hearing that for the next, I don't know, 15 plus minutes would probably get really annoying. So let's give the actual nighttime compositions some time to shine, while we get into my feelings toward the Werehog, which are quite complicated. You see, when looking back at interviews of Hashimoto's thoughts toward the game, he would often state the Werehog was the only aspect of the game they decided on later, as it was not part of the initial pitch. Specifically stating the beat-em-up gameplay style was included as a way to, and I quote, add a stimulating element. That doesn't tell us much, but my interpretation as someone who doesn't have to market the game, and as someone who is well accustomed to old Sonic team's approach to game creation, I believe this was simply added as, well, fluff. I've remarked a few times on both the beauty of the world and the fact that Sonic just rushes through it. This game would not be very long had it been only those day levels. To this I would say quality over quantity, but you'll find it fairly common for lesser reviewers and critics to harp on how long a playthrough of a game is, especially in the 2000s. Lean to a lot of games, needing to create extra busy work and other artificial content to bump those numbers up, as opposed to just giving us a solid 4 to 5 hour experience, which brings us back to the negative side of ambition. They needed this game to feel bigger, not something you could finish in a day. They needed to slow you down, so those sprawling environments they created weren't just going to waste. This mindset seeps further across the game, in the form of a leveling system. In the daytime, it's for Sonic's speed and boost, while for the Werehog, it's combos, strength, a pseudo-devil trigger, and just so much more. Perhaps despite all of that, you're still blasting through the game anyway. Can't have that in a Sonic game, so it forces you to halt your progress and explore the environments for these collectible Sun and Moon medals. These trinkets are used to gate your progress. They're hidden throughout the levels of the game, and if you don't collect enough of them, you'll have no choice but to replay levels to find more, just to move forward. This all sounds like a lot of negativity, and it is. I think Unleashed would be a better game had it not added these elements, but as I said, my feelings are complicated. Because while I never look forward to playing the Werehog, and the other mechanics used to stop your progress, for both him and the exploration of it all, I can't help but still have fun. You can even see this in action in my old playthrough on my second channel, Dimitri Monroe Streams, if you wish so. Just like normal Sonic, as you go through the game and your moveset opens up, it becomes progressively more enjoyable as long as you engage with it. Learn the combat. I genuinely think fondly on my time exploring these levels. I find them well designed. So on some level, having a reason to wander off and see what's out there with the medals is nice. I just don't think it should be mandatory, and should be used for extras. Have them unlock concept art and such. The music that accompanies these levels and exploration are some of the most beautiful pieces in the game, when, you actually get to listen to them. I do love the Werehog's character design. There's frankly a lot I enjoy here, even if this stuff was fluff. That didn't mean they were lazy about what they added. I think just as much as the team cared about Sonic the Hedgehog, they cared about Sonic the Werehog. Perhaps that's why I keep coming back to Unleash itself. I mean, nowadays with Sonic Generations, you can make it near indistinguishable from Sonic Unleashed with modding. Entire levels, the UI, this footage on screen right now is Generations, and I bet a lot of you didn't even notice. But Sonic Generations doesn't have the Werehog. It has Mario 64, but not the Werehog. And for all of its faults, none of which I will ever downplay, are still part of why I love this game. That leaves us with the third major part of Unleashed, the hub worlds. Hubs are an interesting topic to discuss, because throughout the years of listening to others' criticism of games, to when I started writing my own, I felt a disconnect, particularly in this area. Whether it was comparisons to SA2 and SA1, or No More Heroes 2 and No More Heroes 1, or Mario Galaxy 2 and Galaxy 1, a common through line I noticed was many an individual praised the removal of the hub, as it allowed the player to get to the action faster, not bogging them down. While for me, I would, without fail, prefer the first game of these series every time, because I've always found a certain charm to hub worlds. To me, it goes such a long way in making these worlds feel believable, ideally scaling them down to be fun to traverse, but allowing your mind to fill in all those blanks. Unleashed is no exception, and even more than the Werehog, this is the element that cannot be replicated in generations. That keeps me coming back to the game proper. There's something quaint about just talking to the citizens, how they respond to what the current event is, or maybe they have their own problems going on, and you can put your world-saving adventure on hold to help a couple of old-timers. There's so many little storylines going on through this game. Simple stuff like a girl's unrequited love, people just wanting to travel these continents as you do. The fact that all of these characters move around and interact with new people as the game progresses just puts a smile on my face seeing what situations unfold. That's really part of the reason I find this world so great. It's not something simply visual. Unleashed pulls from the real cultures of the world in fun, playful ways. It idealizes reality. You know, perhaps this is a bit of a tangent, but it's become increasingly common for me to turn on a video about some game, like say Power Stone, where then somehow a guy gives me a rant about culture appropriation, or something to that degree, because reviewers are just so desperate to seem more important than they are, I guess, whether it's a YouTuber or Kotaku journalist. But I think that term is so stupid. Culture appropriation, I mean. It's very easy to tell when something is done in admiration, not to mock. And in my experience, people actually native to these cultures, not social media bloggers, genuinely love that sort of addition, which is why I'm bringing it up here. I feel we're getting to a point where sometimes people are afraid to include aspects of work that connect to real culture, especially if they aren't native to it, because they'll be attacked by these unsavory types. I mean, even something like the Straw Hats in the game Stray were put under fire in recent times, as well as a game like Ghost of Tsushima, where despite game journalists attempting to call them out, natives made them ambassadors of the real island. I don't say all of this because Unleashed has ever been in that sphere of conversation, given its release window, but I feel it's worth mentioning because I adore this sort of thing and I don't know when else it'll come up. I have an extra fondness for Spagonia because of how it connects to me. I see reverence throughout this game. In that way, it goes back to how I initially described it. This game looks at the beauty in the world and translates it into its own style. Further, this stylization is obviously carried over to those humans we briefly mentioned. Sonic's had a lot of human designs over the years, but I think Unleashed is the one that hit the best balance. The problem I found with the designs of the past had less to do with the animal friends feeling out of place next to the humans, and more to do with Eggman, actually. Either he's the one who looks out of place next to other humans, or they have to change him to look like said humans, making Eggman in turn seem more like a cosplayer. However, here, the cartoony, exaggerated features of the humans makes the whole world feel cohesive without sacrificing anything. If humans ever come back, and I really hope they do, it should take notes from Unleashed. But speaking of those animal friends, while the roster is lacking in this game, you can find both Amy Rose and Tails in the hub, once you encounter them in the main story. Tails' dialogue is pretty standard, usually updating you on your objective, but Amy's role here really sticks out, despite being mostly optional. You can talk to her at any point in the game and she'll always have new dialogue on the current events, always cheering you on, telling you how amazing her Sonic is. Later, you can even agree to go on a date with her. That canonically leads into another amazing game in the series. Really, this show as Hashimoto is basically a genius, as I should always be able to date Amy Rose in a Sonic game. All of this is what's so great about hub worlds, not just here but in general. The interactions you can have within it and seeing how your own actions can affect the outer world. When I go back to Unleashed, I don't only look forward to running through the world at breakneck speeds. Sometimes it's just the little things, the conversations, and the journey that lies between everything else. Story, an aspect that feels lacking as of late in Sonic games. However, Unleashed was one of the last games in the series that I believe stood strong in this department. That being said though, it does tie into why these games have seen a decline. I've talked a lot about the ambitions of Sonic Unleashed, but one factor behind this I've glossed over is Sonic 06. The game needs no introduction, I'm sure. So to keep it brief, after the release of Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic games have been receiving less and less critical reception, culminating in Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 releasing as a buggy, incomplete mess that did not land with fans, critics, anybody really. And at a time when internet reviewer culture, whether it be from sites like IGN or ye olde YouTube, had become quite popular, it would end up resulting in the game becoming infamous. It was a laughingstock, leading to a lot of decisions with this franchise going forth, trying desperately to get away from that image. So it's no exaggeration to say one of the motivating factors for Unleashed to make such a big impression was an attempt to overshadow the failure of 06. And many other decisions can be traced back to that game as well. It's why we see very minimal involvement from the other characters in Unleashed. Sonic 06 had complaints of too many friends. It's probably why, even though they felt they needed to flesh out the game time, they still had to contrive a reason for it to be only Sonic who does so. I know a lot of people, especially with hindsight, say they yearn for the time before the series changed directions. And yeah, later games in the series, in a desperate bid to never associate with 06, go too far to the other end. I completely agree. I much prefer Sonic 06 or, say, Shadow to Lost World or Forces. However, I still think those lessons needed to be learned. I'm not of the belief that Sonic should never touch darker elements and stories, but I do think the series felt bloated and full of melodrama. Sonic is literally unfun as a character in 06 throughout most of its runtime. This is like a cardinal sin to me. In contrast, Unleashed is a perfect example of how you can still have your fun and whimsy while also having a genuinely touching story that is taken seriously. Despite the massive scale of the world, the narrative is really simple, down to earth if you will. Sonic meets Chip through the events of the opening. He's an amnesiac. As such, Sonic, being the kind-natured guy he is, adds helping the stranger rediscover his memory onto his list of objectives, in tandem with restoring the emeralds and figuring out this whole monster form he's acquired. Amy and Tails do show up, and again, I really like Amy's role, but it's minimal. Even Eggman is mostly just in the story through brief cutaways. His characterization is on point, I will say, but again, he sticks to the background the majority of the journey. And I'm not even saying that as a negative. The core of this adventure is like a buddy road trip film. It's just two bros traveling the world together, and that's awesome. This is very observable through the cutscenes, but there's a lot of extra optional content that plays into this as well, such as collecting and trying out food with Chip. But my favorite of this content is the collection of collectibles scattered around the game world. If you find these few choice movie tapes, you unlock CG short films of Sonic and Chip hanging out in the various locations you're exploring. They're inconsequential and are played for laughs, so it makes sense that they're optional, but I find what they add to be extremely valuable. As I said, I enjoyed the slower moments in between, and this shows how much Sonic and Chip did as well. Sure, there's urgent world-ending problems to deal with, but that doesn't mean you can't stop to enjoy the scenery and have a bite to eat with your buddy. Frankly, these animations have more effort put into them than the entirety of story-important cutscenes later in the series. Furthermore, after the release of this game, they put out an extra animation called Night of the Werehog, seemingly in part based on a series of side missions in the game where you have to clear out a pair of ghosts from various locations in the world. Here though, it's a haunted mansion the two find, and end up exploring on a rainy night. Hijinks and battles ensue, culminating in a cute ghost girl becoming infatuated with Sonic, and a less happy ending for Chip. All of these animations are told with no dialogue, yet the characters' personalities, expression, all shine through, and perhaps most importantly, the relationship seen within them makes these two's care for each other all the more believable. So yeah, I really like Chip. I think little mascot info characters get a bad rap, and that's in some parts deserved, as they can be intrusive or annoying, but I've always enjoyed his company. In fact, he's sort of relatable in a way, at least to me. This world is Sonic's world. He clearly doesn't act at all shocked or like he's taking in any new sights throughout the game. I mean, he's Sonic the Hedgehog. He's probably been around this entire big blue orb twice in the past week alone. However, Chip has that amnesia, making everything he sees or does be viewed as a first experience to him, just as it is to the player. The way Chip is infatuated with the world he's found himself in, the way he talks about how much fun he's had adventuring with Sonic, seeing all these new places and experiences. On some level, I feel the same every time I reach the end of the game. Ambition has been the theme of today, and perhaps that word is more relevant to Sonic than ever. He's heading a movie franchise, a new TV show, the comics are going strong. Hell, the new game is open world, a genre that, while I don't really agree with the classification, is very so often used synonymous with that word. And honestly, the more I see of Frontiers, the more I see glimpses of things I like. This could be a new era for Sonic, and I hope it's great. I hope I feel ambition in it, just like I did back in 2008 with Unleashed, which is something that I have not been able to say to any extent since 2012. However, it's still different. Frontiers is creating this big open space, sure, but to me, Unleashed created an entire world, on top of all the extra care and thought put into the little things, that I'm not sure I see with Frontiers. Maybe it was said for marketing, but I think Hashimoto's words rung true in the end. From the fast split-second gameplay it can provide, the fun exploring of a fantastical world, a story that knows both when to have fun and when to buckle down and take itself seriously, the music that never leaves my head, whether it's keeping up with the fast-paced action of the day or the somber of the night, for all the little missteps on its way to the finish line, for every bend of the knee crushing beneath the weight of Sonic Unleashed's ambition. It's still what Sonic should be.